In this next section, we want to talk about Chapter 4 of Norm Geisler's book, Christian Ethics, Options and Issues. And it's the section on generalism. Generalists are utilitarians. Utilitarians are not antinomian because they do believe in some general principles, general expectations, general outcomes. So they're not against the law, but they aren't absolutists either, because there is no situation that is always the same. There is no one set of values that can consistently be applied to the same situation. Because generalism is so general, there are four basic categories of people or views. There is Jeremy Bentham, who believes in a quantitative utilitarianism. He wants to bring some objectivity to the subjectivity of generalism, and so he has what he calls the pleasure calculus. He says nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure, and it is for them alone to point out which or what we ought to do, as well as what we shall do. He says these are summed up in the principle of utility, which affirms the position which states the greatest happiness of all those whose interest is in question as being the right and the proper, the only right and proper and universally desirable end of human action. In view of this, an action then may be said to be conformable to the principle of utility when the tendency it has to augment the happiness of the community. The happiness of, at this point, it could even be a very fine majority over a minority. When he talks about the calculation pleasure principle, he tries to bring 6 or 7 factors to it. And of course, these are all determined individually. The individual person has to determine the value of the pleasure or pain in itself. And it's determined by the intensity, the duration of it, the certainty or uncertainty of it, the remoteness of it, how far away is it, the chance of can this produce something similar to it again, the idea of purity, well, what are the chances that it will produce the opposite and kind of backfire? And then the 7th principle is the number of persons to whom it extends. So Bentham wants to try to bring some objectivity to the whole subjectivity of this. But how do you know? How do you know what people, until they've experienced it, how do they know if it's pleasurable or painful? And sometimes it's pleasurable one time and painful the next. John Stuart Mill believes in a qualitative utilitarianism. It's not just in the quantity of how long, how many, how far, but is it a quality? Pleasure is defined qualitatively. One is obligated to seek the highest kind of pleasure for the greatest number of people. Here again, the difficulty is, how do we know that this is going to be pleasurable to everyone? How do we know it's going to be consistently pleasurable to everyone? I mean, pleasure is determined, they would say, normatively. There are valid moral rules, beliefs, and codes to guide human decisions towards maximizing the good in society. But none of these, they would say, are universal. None of these is without exception. So what is pleasurable to one society might be a painful experience to another. If both of them are seeking a qualitative experience, you're going to have some great conflicts. The problem with the exceptions, Mill acknowledges that exceptions ought to be both recognized as exceptions and have their limits. In other words, you can only have a certain number of exceptions. But of course, when you have lots of exceptions, then they're no longer the exceptions, they become the rule. The problem with these exceptions is, how do you define them? And so Mill acknowledges that exceptions ought to be both recognized as exceptions and limited, but how do you limit them if you have a slight majority over a minority, and then you have a small shift? All of a sudden the minority is the majority, and your ethics and your values and everything has to change. G.E. Moore is another generalist. He believes in general rules and universal obedience. He divides it into three categories. There are two categories. There are act utilitarians, and then there are the rule utilitarians. Act utilitarians believe that an ethical act must be judged by its consequences, and its consequences only. Rule utilitarians believe rules shouldn't be broken unless there is an absolute conflict between the rules. So they would say rules are generally valid, but again, you have to look at every situation. Some general rules, they say, should never be broken. An individual ought never disobey a rule which is held by most men to be true in general. Well, most Germans felt that Jews should be eliminated in Nazi Germany. Is that going to be an acceptable ethic? You had the same thing in Vietnam. You had the same thing in Cambodia. We've seen the same thing to justify genocide and homicide over and over again. In either event, there are no actions or kinds of actions which are really universally wrong. They are only some things generally wrong, which one ought, for utilitarian reasons, to avoid universally. Now, in the act utilitarian, for instance, if it's only the outcome that really counts, it's only the result that truly matters. And so if you don't accomplish your goal, it's been a wasted ethic. John Austin is another one. He says there are no general rules should be broken. Rules are justified by general results. This would be a look at all of society and say, society comes to the common understanding of certain universal general rules, and these, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not abuse your parents. These things ought to be consistently kept. Universal rule keeping is justified by its general results and traditional good for society. So traditionally, utilitarians argue that an action should be judged on whether it would bring the greatest good to the greatest number of people. Well, when you have nations in conflict, somebody's got to go. The difficulty with this is the majority dominates the minority until basically the minority is eliminated. Well, then you have a majority that's going to divide again according to some other issue. There will be a majority and a minority, and they will just feed and eat and devour each other until there is very little left. What is a general evaluation of generalism, or generalism evaluated? One might find some value in generalism. First, generalism reflects a need for norms. If not absolutes, it says we got to have some norms, got to have something by which society governs itself. Second, it offers a possible solution to conflicting norms, because they would say if two norms come in conflict, then you pick the one that has the greater majority. If one brings 55% blessing or benefit to society, another one brings 70, well, then you go for the 70. Finally, some generalists even argue for unbreakable norms. The difficulty is that none of them agree on what are the unbreakable norms, because somebody is always breaking them. Someone is always finding a situation, a unique, one-of-a-kind, special situation where you say, oh, well, the norm needs to be broken. And so then you have exceptions, and you kind of chip away at the foundation until it falls. What are some inadequacies of generalism? The biggest one is that the end does not justify the means. In other words, in generalism, if you don't have the outcome, then it was worthless. If a person dives into the water to save someone, and that person dies, the victim dies, and the person who dives in to save them, it doesn't save them, well then it's not a virtuous act, it's not a heroic act, it might even be viewed as a stupid act because you risked your life and you had no outcome, you had no result. Generalism has no universal norms. Utilitarian acts by themselves have no intrinsic value unless you accomplish your goal. So the attempt to save a life is not an intrinsically valuable act. It has value only if the person is actually saved, or if from that some good comes. Thus, the utilitarian position reduces ethical values of acts to the fates and fortunes of life, not the attitude, not the inner person, not even the attempt is of virtue or value unless the outcome is accomplished. A person could say, well, I'm doing research in cancer, and I want to save children from dying of this particular cancer. If in the process they discovered a cure to another kind of disease, or even a cancer for adults, they would say, well, I guess there's some virtue, but it wasn't the ultimate virtue because we didn't accomplish our goal. So in generalism, we have a need for an absolute norm, and you can't have an absolute norm without some source of divine, absolute, true truth. The end is always an ambiguous goal, very difficult to clearly define. Geisler gives a summary. He says this, however, since he has no absolute moral principles, that is the generalist, his views tend to be reducible ultimately to antinomianism, because for every general principle, there's an exception to do away with it. Unless there are some objective moral prescriptions of substantive content, which for Christians, they would believe that that is the absolute authority and truth of God's Word. These substantive content, which are binding on all persons at all times, then at any given time it is possible that any action could be justified, at least justified in the mind of the person. And if you don't have any absolutes, then how do you condemn? Of course, they would go back to the majority. But the majority and the views of majority are constantly changing and quote-unquote constantly evolving. So these three views, which are not views or options for Christians, antinomianism, situationism, and generalism, are unacceptable. Antinomianism again says lying is neither right nor wrong. Generalism says lying is generally wrong. Situationalism says lying is sometimes the right thing to do. Now, in our next discussion, we're going to look at three absolute views and three that can be embraced or should be embraced by a Christian worldview. Unqualified absolutism, which says lying is always wrong, no exceptions. Conflicting absolutism, which says lying is forgivable. And graded absolutism, which says lying is sometimes right. It's sometimes necessary to obey the higher law.